Your brother has the spark of a leader, Evelyn. You only have the hands of a worker. Those words from my father felt like a cold blade in my chest. We stood in the hangar of Vanguard Aerotech, the company my family built. In front of us was the X-1 jet. I had spent 3 years designing it. I had skipped sleep and meals to make the math perfect. But my father didn't see me. He only saw Julian, my stepbrother. Julian stood there in a $1,000 suit, smiling at the cameras. He hadn't touched a single tool, yet the world thought he was a genius. Julian is the visionary, my father told the reporters. Evelyn just helps with the paperwork. I looked at my hands. They were stained with oil. I looked at Julian's hands. They were clean. I realized then that my father would never let me lead. He didn't want a CEO. He wanted a ghost to do the work while his favorite son took the glory. Julian wasn't even my blood. My father married his mother, Diana, 10 years ago. From the first day, Julian was the golden boy. He was loud, handsome, and knew how to charm people. I was the quiet girl who loved physics and engines. "We are a team," my father used to say. But his idea of a team was me doing the work and Julian getting the praise. I went to the best engineering school and graduated at the top of my class. Julian barely finished his business degree. It didn't matter. To my father, a man with a loud voice was always better than a woman with the right answers. Diana whispered in my father's ear every night. She told him I was too technical and stiff. Slowly, my father started to believe her. He stopped asking for my opinion. He only asked for my blueprints so Julian could present them as his own. The Icarus project was meant to be our future. It was a jet that used hydrogen for fuel. It was dangerous and complicated. I had been working on the safety specs for months. "This is the project that will make us billions," my father announced at the board meeting. He pointed to a drawing of the jet on the wall. "Julian will be the lead director. He will have the final word on everything." My heart dropped. Julian didn't know how to handle hydrogen. It was highly explosive. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "the fuel tanks in Julian's drawing are too close to the engines. They will overheat. The plane will explode." Julian laughed. It was a cruel, condescending sound. "Evelyn, you are so boring. You are always worried about safety and details. We need to be bold. The investors want a sleek plane, not a flying tank." My father nodded in agreement. "Listen to your brother, Evelyn. Just build what he tells you to build." I spent that night in the lab, staring at the 3D models of Julian's bold wing design. The math was a nightmare. He had thinned the wing tips to make the plane look more like a bird, but he ignored the air pressure. At high speeds, the wings wouldn't just vibrate, they would snap like dry twigs. I printed out the stress reports and stayed up until dawn to highlight the danger zones in bright red. I thought if I showed my father the cold, hard numbers, he would have to listen. He was a businessman, and a crashed plane was bad for business. But I was still thinking like a daughter, not a chess player. The next morning, I walked into my father's office. I placed the stress reports on his desk. "The wings are a death trap, Dad," I said. "If we build them this way, the pilot won't survive the first turn." My father didn't even open the folder. He was busy looking at a magazine cover featuring Julian. "Julian says you're just trying to slow him down," he said without looking up. "He says you're stuck in the old way of doing things." "It's not an opinion, it's physics," I shouted. It was the first time I had raised my voice in years. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were cold. "You are a technician, Evelyn. You handle the bolts. Julian handles the vision. If you can't do your job without complaining, I'll find someone who can." He threw my report into the trash can. My heart broke, but my mind finally cleared. I realized then that if he wanted a vision, I would let him have it, along with all the consequences. I didn't argue anymore. I went back to my desk and did something I had never done before. I stopped being helpful. I opened a private, encrypted cloud drive that only I could access. I titled it The Truth. Every email I sent to Julian warning him about the wings, I BCC'd to that drive. Every time I told my father about the cooling system and he ignored me, I recorded the date and time. I even saved the security footage of him throwing my report away. I was going to build exactly what they asked for. I would be the perfect worker they wanted. But I was also building a cage made of evidence. If they wanted to drive the company off a cliff, I was going to make sure my name wasn't on the steering wheel when it happened. A few days later, a group of men in dark suits arrived at the office. They were from the Meridian Group, a massive investment firm. They didn't care about planes, they only cared about profit. Julian spent the whole afternoon laughing with them and showing off my blueprints as if he had drawn them himself. By evening, the news broke. Julian had signed a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The catch? We had to have a working prototype ready for a public flight in just 6 months. It was a suicide mission. Any real engineer knew it took years to test a hydrogen jet. But my father and Julian were too busy popping champagne to care about the timeline. To celebrate the deal, my father threw a massive gala. The ballroom was filled with the most powerful people in the industry. I wore a simple black dress and tried to stay in the corners, but my father pulled me onto the stage during his speech. "I want to thank my son, Julian, for his genius," he told the crowd. Then he looked at me with a fake smile. "And of course, my daughter Evelyn. She's the one who keeps the coffee hot and the spreadsheets organized while the men do the heavy lifting." The room erupted in laughter. I felt my face burn with shame. Julian winked at me, enjoying my pain. I realized then that they didn't just want my work. They wanted to humiliate me so I would never have the courage to stand up to them. I stood there, clapping politely, while I secretly thought about the encrypted drive in my office. The next morning, an old man was waiting for me in my lab. It was my grandfather, Silas. He had founded this company 40 years ago, but my father had forced him into retirement when his health dipped. Silas looked at the new wing design on my screen and shook his head. "This isn't a plane, Evelyn," he whispered. "It's a coffin." He looked at me with sharp, intelligent eyes. He knew I was the one actually doing the work. He reached into his coat and handed me a small, rusted iron key. "Your father thinks he owns this company," Silas said. "But the original charter I wrote has rules he's forgotten. There's a safe in my old estate. Use this key. It's time you stopped being a ghost and started being a Vance." I drove to my grandfather's old estate that night. The house was a crumbling mansion filled with dusty blueprints and models of old planes. Following his directions, I found a heavy steel safe hidden behind a painting of the company's first hangar. The rusted iron key turned with a heavy click. Inside wasn't money or gold. It was a thick stack of yellowed papers, the original founding charter of Vanguard Aerotech. As I read the fine print, my breath hitched. My grandfather had been a genius at more than just engines. He was a genius at protection. He had built a kill switch into the legal heart of the company to prevent exactly what my father was doing. The secret in the papers was called the competency clause. It stated that if the acting CEO ever knowingly bypassed safety protocols for financial gain, the board could be bypassed, and ownership would revert to the lead architect of record. My father had spent years calling me a technician and a support worker, but on every official patent and every government safety filing, my name was the one that carried the legal weight. I was the lead architect of record. If I could prove that my father and Julian were ignoring a fatal flaw, the company wouldn't just be mine. It would be legally stripped from them in a single day. The next morning, I saw Julian at my computer station. He looked nervous. When I checked the system logs after he left, I found something that made my blood run cold. To get the Meridian Group's next payment, we needed a signed safety readiness certificate. I had refused to sign it because the wing tests were failing, but the system now showed my digital signature as approved. Julian had stolen my password and forged my name on a federal document. He didn't just ignore my warnings, he had committed a crime using my identity. I didn't delete the signature. Instead, I took a screenshot of the login IP address, which led straight to Julian's office, and added it to the truth folder. I made a choice that morning. I stopped fixing things. Usually, when I saw a mistake in Julian's calculations, I would quietly correct it before the parts went to the factory. Not anymore. When the head of manufacturing called to ask why the wing bolts didn't fit the frame, I didn't tell him the math was wrong. I simply said, "Follow Julian's blueprint exactly. He's the lead." For the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't being lazy. I was letting the visionary see what happens when the worker stops carrying him. A week later, the loud bang of an engine failure shook the entire facility. The prototype was undergoing a static ground test. Fire crews rushed to the scene as black smoke poured from the turbine. I stood by the window of the lab, watching the chaos. Julian was screaming at the mechanics, blaming them for the fire. He didn't realize that he had ordered a fuel pump that couldn't handle the pressure of hydrogen. My father stood next to him, looking worried for the first time. I didn't go down to help. I just sat at my desk and logged the failure into my secret drive. My father burst into my lab an hour later. His face was red and he was sweating. "Why didn't you catch that fuel pump error, Evelyn?" he barked. "That test cost us $3 million. I looked him in the eye, my face perfectly calm. "I told you last month that the fuel system was unstable, Dad. You told me to stop overanalyzing and build what Julian wanted. So I did." He opened his mouth to yell, but he stopped. He remembered the conversation. For a second, I saw a flash of fear in his eyes. He realized that without me protecting them, they were flying blind. But his pride was too big. "Just fix it," he snapped. "And don't let it happen again." He didn't stay to hear that I wouldn't be fixing a single thing. While the hangar was busy with repairs, I stayed late to do a different kind of work. I used a special access code my grandfather gave me to look at the company's bank accounts. What I found was shocking. Julian hadn't just been making bad planes, he had been making bad deals. He was taking the money from the Meridian Group and moving it into private offshore accounts. He was stealing from our family to fund his own lifestyle. He thought he was untouchable because Dad never checked the math. I downloaded every bank statement and added them to my secret folder. The golden boy wasn't just incompetent, he was a thief. The next day, I noticed a man I didn't recognize talking to Julian in the parking lot. He wasn't an investor. He was a known corporate raider who worked for our biggest rival. I realized then that Julian's plan was even worse than I thought. He wasn't trying to make the Icarus project succeed. He was trying to make it fail so the company's stock would crash. Once the price was low enough, his friends at the Meridian Group would buy everything for pennies. Julian was helping them steal my grandfather's legacy from the inside. He didn't care if the company died, as long as he got his cut of the deal. The deadline for the first flight was only a month away. The Meridian Group sent a formal letter demanding to see a successful flight, or they would pull all their money. My father was panicking. He called a meeting and begged the engineering team to work 24 hours a day. "We promised them a miracle," Dad said, looking at the floor. "If we don't fly, we lose everything." Julian sat there, acting like he cared, but I saw him checking his watch. He wanted the deadline to fail. I looked at the team of tired engineers. They were good people who were going to lose their jobs because of two men's greed. I decided right then that I wouldn't just watch the company fall. I would wait for the perfect moment to take the wheel. It was my 31st birthday, but the dinner felt like a funeral. Diana had ordered an expensive cake, but the conversation was only about Julian. She spent the entire night talking about how he was the face of the new generation. "Evelyn," Diana said, wiping her mouth with a silk napkin. "Your father and I were talking. Once the Icarus flies, we think you should move to the marketing department. You're so quiet, and the lab is so dirty. It's time you acted like a lady of the family." I looked at my father. He didn't look up from his steak. He was letting her push me out of my own life's work. I didn't get angry. I just smiled and took a bite of cake. It tasted like ash, but I didn't care. I knew something they didn't. By the time marketing had a job for me, I would be the one deciding if Diana still had a credit card. I went back to the hangar late that night. I found Julian in the cockpit of the prototype. He was taking pictures of the control panel to send to his friends at Meridian. He jumped when he saw me. "Just checking the aesthetics, sis," he said, trying to act cool. "The aesthetics won't matter when the fuel lines freeze at 30,000 feet, Julian," I said quietly. He stepped out of the plane and got close to me. "Listen, Evelyn, you're smart, but you're a loser. This company is moving on. Either get on board or get out of the way. Dad already chose me. Nothing you say can change that." He walked away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and betrayal in the air. I looked at the plane. I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, my father walked onto the hangar floor with a megaphone. He looked tired but desperate. "Listen up," he shouted to the workers. "In 2 weeks, we are holding a public flight for the press and the investors. The Icarus will fly, or Vanguard Aerotech is finished." The engineers looked at each other in fear. The plane wasn't ready. The software was glitching, and the wings were still weak. "Evelyn will sign the final safety flight log by Friday," my father added, pointing at me. The room went silent. Everyone knew that if I signed it, I was the one who would go to jail if the plane crashed. My father was finally using me as a human shield for Julian's mess. I looked at him and nodded slowly. I would sign it, but not in the way he expected. I sent one final email to my father and Julian. I made sure to mark it high priority and urgent. I wrote in plain words that the wing structure would fail if the plane reached 20,000 feet. I told them exactly how to fix it, knowing they wouldn't spend the money or the time. 5 minutes later, I saw Julian walk into my father's office. Through the glass wall, I saw my father look at the screen, shake his head, and delete the message. They thought I was just protecting myself. They didn't realize I was giving them one last chance to be honest. I saved the message deleted notification to my private drive. The trap was set. On Thursday, Julian burst into my lab with 2 security guards. He was holding a printout of my secret risk log that I had purposefully left on my desk for him to find. "I knew it," he shouted. "You've been keeping a list of failures to make me look bad. You're trying to sabotage the company." He showed the papers to my father, who followed him in. "Is this true, Evelyn?" my father asked, his voice shaking with anger. "Are you working against your own brother?" "That's a list of safety warnings you ignored, Dad," I said calmly. Julian laughed and tore the papers into pieces. "It's a list of lies," Julian said. He turned to the guards. "Take her computer and lock her out of the system. She's banned from the hangar until after the flight." My father stood there and watched them take my work away. He didn't say a word to stop them. The night before the flight, I used my grandfather's old master key to get back into the hangar. I didn't touch the plane. I just wanted to see it one last time. My father found me standing there in the dark. "I gave you everything, Evelyn," he said, his voice sounding old. "A job, a name, a future. Why are you doing this?" "You gave me a job, but you gave Julian my life," I replied. "You knew he was failing, and you made me fix it in secret so he could look like a hero. Why didn't you ever believe in me?" He looked at the plane and then at me. "Because a company like this needs a face people can trust. Julian has that face. You're just a girl who's good at math." He told me to leave and never come back. I walked out into the cool night air. I wasn't crying. I was ready. The sun rose over the desert runway, turning the sand into gold. Hundreds of reporters and investors sat in the viewing stands. Huge screens showed the Icarus jet shimmering in the heat. It looked perfect, but I knew the truth hidden under the paint. I arrived at the airfield wearing a sharp navy suit. I didn't go to the engineering tent. Instead, I sat in the front row of the guest section. When my father saw me, his eyes widened. He thought I would be hiding at home. Julian stood near the plane, giving interviews and pointing at the wings I had designed. He looked like a king, but he was standing on a foundation of sand. The pilot for the flight was Mike, a man who had flown for my grandfather for 20 years. Before he climbed into the cockpit, he found me in the crowd. His face was pale. "Evelyn," he whispered, "the vibration in the sensors is already starting, and we haven't even left the ground. Is it safe?" I looked him in the eye. I couldn't let a good man die for their greed. "Mike, look at the wing stress monitor. If it hits the yellow zone before you reach 10,000 feet, get out. Do not try to be a hero." He nodded, his hands shaking. He walked to the plane and told my father he had concerns. My father just pushed him toward the stairs. "The world is watching, Mike. Don't embarrass us." Mike climbed into the cockpit, but 5 minutes later he climbed back out. He threw his helmet on the ground. "I'm not flying that thing," he yelled loud enough for the reporters to hear. "The pressure readings are wrong. It's a suicide mission." The crowd started to whisper. Investors looked at their phones. Julian panicked. He grabbed a microphone and laughed. "Our pilot has a case of nerves," he shouted. But the Icarus is so advanced it can fly itself. We will use the remote piloting system from the ground. That's how much I trust my design." My father tried to stop him, but Julian was too desperate to save his own ego. He pushed the button to start the engines. The engines roared to life with a high-pitched scream. Without a pilot inside, the Icarus looked like a ghost ship. It sped down the runway and lifted into the sky. The crowd cheered as the silver plane climbed higher and higher. I watched the giant screen showing the live flight data. At 15,000 feet, the numbers began to flicker. The wing sensors were screaming in red, but Julian was too busy waving to the cameras to notice. "Look at that stability," he shouted into the microphone. Then a loud, metallic snap echoed through the speakers. The plane tilted sharply to the left. The cheering stopped instantly. The left wing didn't just bend, it disintegrated. Pieces of expensive carbon fiber rained down like confetti. On the screen, the horizon spun wildly as the plane entered a death spiral. There was a deafening explosion as the hydrogen tanks ignited. A ball of orange fire lit up the desert sky. For a few seconds, the world was silent. Then, the shockwave hit the viewing stands, rattling the glass. The multi-billion-dollar future of flight was now just a black scar on the desert floor. My father fell into his seat, his face as white as a sheet. Julian dropped the microphone, his hands trembling. The panic was immediate. Reporters swarmed my father and Julian, screaming questions. Who signed the safety logs? Why did the wings fail? Julian grabbed my father's arm. "It was Evelyn," he yelled, pointing at me in the crowd. "She was the lead engineer. She sabotaged the math because she was jealous. She signed the papers." My father looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a leader. He looked like a coward. He nodded to the press. "My daughter was responsible for the technical side. We will be holding a full investigation into her conduct." They were ready to throw me to the wolves to save their names. 3 hours later, the air in the boardroom was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and panic. The major investors and the board of directors sat around the table. They looked like they wanted to commit murder. My father stood at the head of the table. "This is a tragedy," he said, his voice faking a sob. "But the fault lies with my daughter, Evelyn. She intentionally hid the wing defects from us. We are firing her immediately and will cooperate with the police." Julian sat next to him, nodding solemnly. "I trusted her," Julian added, wiping a fake tear. "I gave her the vision and she poisoned it." They thought they had won. They thought they had found the perfect scapegoat. I didn't wait for them to finish. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. 2 security guards tried to stop me, but I held up a legal document signed by my grandfather. "I am the lead architect of record," I said, my voice loud and clear. "And I have something you all need to see." I pushed a small USB drive, the ghost key, into the laptop. The giant wall monitors flickered to life. Instead of the pretty pictures Julian liked to show, the screens filled with the emails I had sent. I showed the board the message-deleted notifications from my father's computer. Then, I showed the video of Julian using my password to forge my signature on the safety logs while I was out of the room. The room went deathly silent. "That's not all," a deep, gravelly voice said from the doorway. The heavy doors swung open, and my grandfather Silas walked in. He wasn't the weak old man they remembered. He was dressed in a sharp suit and carried himself with the power of the man who had built this empire. My father's jaw dropped. "Father, you're supposed to be in the hospital." "I was waiting for you to prove how little you care about this family's name, Arthur," Silas said. He walked to the head of the table and placed a heavy stack of papers down. "I built a competency clause into this company. It says that if a CEO lies about safety to make money, they are out. And according to these records, Evelyn is the only one who actually knows how to run a business." The lawyers for the board began reading the documents my grandfather had provided. Their eyes went wide. My father tried to grab the papers, but Silas pushed his hand away. "The charter is clear, Arthur," Silas said. "By ignoring the wing defects and allowing a forged signature, you have forfeited your right to lead. The company's ownership is now frozen." The board members looked at each other. They didn't care about my father's pride anymore. They cared about their lost millions. One by one, they looked at me. I wasn't the technical assistant anymore. I was the only person in the room who had predicted exactly what would happen to the plane. The power in the room shifted like a physical weight, landing squarely on my shoulders. I moved to invoke the competency clause, the head of the board announced. And I moved to name Evelyn Vance as the interim CEO and chairperson, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. Not a single person raised their hand for my father. Julian tried to stand up and protest, but a board member told him to sit down and be quiet. I walked to the head of the table. My father was still sitting in the big leather chair. I didn't say anything, I just looked at him. Slowly, with his head hanging low, he stood up and moved to the side. I sat down in the chair. It was still warm from his body, but it belonged to me now. "Let's get to work," I said. "We have a company to save." Julian was the first person I dealt with. He was shaking, his face a mix of anger and terror. "You can't do this, Evelyn. We're family." "Family doesn't forge signatures to send pilots into the sky in a death trap," I said. I looked at the 2 security guards who had escorted me out just days ago. "Please escort Mr. Julian out of the building. Revoke his access codes and clear his desk. If he tries to take a single file, call the police." Julian started to scream, calling me every name he could think of. The guards grabbed his arms and dragged him toward the door. The golden boy was kicking and shouting like a child having a tantrum. I didn't feel happy watching it. I just felt a deep sense of relief. The poison was finally being pulled out of the company. The boardroom cleared until only my father and I remained. The silence was heavy. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, there was no judgment in his eyes, only a desperate kind of hope. "Evelyn, you have to understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I did it for the legacy. I wanted a strong face for the company. We can fix this. Just tell the board it was a misunderstanding. I'll make you a partner, a real one." I looked at the empty seat where Julian had sat. "You had 20 years to make me a partner, Dad. Instead, you made me a ghost. You didn't care about the legacy, you cared about the image. You gambled with people's lives to keep that image alive." I stood up and gathered my tablet. "I'm not a technician who can fix this mistake for you. You're fired, Arthur. Go home." The next day, the leaders of the Meridian Group marched into my new office. They were ready to sue Vanguard Aerotech for every penny we had. They thought they had me trapped because of the crash. I didn't let them speak. I threw a file on the desk showing Julian's offshore bank accounts. "Julian was working with your rivals to crash our stock," I told them. "That's fraud. And since you signed the deal with a man who was knowingly committing fraud, your contract is void." Their faces turned pale. I leaned forward. "But I'm feeling generous. I've used my own inheritance to buy out your debt. You don't own us anymore. I own you. You will either work under my terms, or I will hand these files to the federal investigators." They left the room without saying a single word. I didn't spend my first week as CEO in the big office. I went down to the hangar. I called all the mechanics, the junior engineers, and the janitors together. These were the people my father never looked at. "The Icarus project failed because it was built on lies," I told them. "We are going to build the Icarus too, but this time we do it right. No shortcuts. No visions that ignore physics. If any one of you sees a bolt that doesn't fit, you come to me directly." The room erupted in real, honest cheers. For the first time, the hangar didn't feel like a cold cave. It felt like a workshop again. I promoted the head mechanic to be my right-hand man. We started tearing down the old wreckage to see what we could learn from the fire. We were starting over, and this time, the foundation was made of truth. 6 months later, I stood on the runway again. The air was quiet, and the smell of the desert was clean. There were no cameras this time. There were no investors or fancy gala tents. There was only my team and the Icarus, too. The plane looked different now. It wasn't sleek or bird-like in the way Julian had wanted. It was sturdy. It was powerful. It was designed to stay in the air, not just to look good in a magazine. I watched the fuel gauges on my tablet. The hydrogen cooling cycle was perfect, exactly as I had calculated years ago. "Ready for takeoff, boss," Mike's voice crackled through my radio. He was back in the cockpit. He had come back the moment he heard I was in charge. "Take her up, Mike," I said. I watched as the jet sped down the runway. It lifted into the air with a smooth, steady hum. I followed the data as it climbed. 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet. The wing sensors stayed in the green. It was beautiful. I thought about my father and Julian. They were living in a small house on the coast, far away from the world they had tried to rule. They were yesterday's news. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't have the time for it. I looked up at the sky. The plane was a tiny silver speck now, flying higher than any of them thought possible. I wasn't the worker or the supporter or the invisible daughter. I was the pilot of my own life, and for the first time, the view was perfect.